Minister for Crime Prevention.
Thank you, Speaker. On December 23, 2019, Victoria fared well a truly great leader of the state whose integrity and passion knows no bounds. A Victorian to his core, John Cain was a man driven by his values, not politics. The son of a former Premier and entrepreneurial dressmaker, John was destined to lead the life of purpose and service. As journalist Tim Goldbach recently wrote, some politicians become accidental leaders. John Cain, by contrast, seemed marked out for leadership from birth. Born in 1931, he was bright and diligent, attending Northcote High while his father was Premier, and he went on to go to Scotch College, and I imagine that must have felt like enemy territory for some period of time. He studied law at Melbourne Uni, was a solicitor in Preston and president of the Law Institute. He also became an activist in the party, seeing firsthand and holding to account some elements in the party that were more intent on power within the party than getting power to form government. As we heard from the former Attorney-General Michael Duffy yesterday, with the Whitlam government and the participants, including a list of former Victorian Governor Dick McGarvey, Senate Leader and Minister John Button and Federal President Barry Jones, their theme was one of unification and bringing about change to the party. In helping unify the Victorian Labor Party, he brought about transformational change for our state also, Speaker. His style of politics was never to divide. He saw consensus where he could and was never afraid to stand up for the values that guided him. He was a powerful voice in the fight over granting women full membership to some of Victoria's largest sporting clubs. At the time of John's passing, I was very pleased to read how he refused to accept invitations of clubs that excluded women as members, and we heard yesterday some of the great examples why he wouldn't attend any event unless Nancy was invited also. He showed leadership through the appointment of the first woman, Pauline Toner, to arguably Victoria, Australia's most exclusive club, the Victorian Cabinet. His reforms in Indigenous land rights, occupational health and safety, as well as improvements to government transparency are only some of the reforms that reflect the type of Premier John was through his 8.5 years. His deep sense of doing what was right over what might be controversial was one of the qualities that ought to be remembered today. The ethos of deep sense of integrity was something that he was very committed to. I'm reminded of his integrity through his work as both Premier and Attorney-General in the introduction of the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions in Victoria. When asked why he wanted to divorce the criminal prosecution process away from politicians, his answer was simple: it had to be done. He knew above everything that integrity of our justice system was something that could never be traded off, never be compromised. In founding the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions and enshrining that office in legislation, John said, "It just seemed to me that it was right. It was difficult to achieve. It had to be done." He may have been a politician, but politics never defined him. Every day during his 3 terms as Premier, he wore the expectations of Victoria on his shoulders. He knew that the bond between his government and the people of Victoria was built on trust and integrity of the highest level. Integrity was the principle which saw John take a party that was deeply divided and turn it into a credible government. Integrity guided everything that his government did. Finally, I want to pay tribute to the Premier and Minister for Sport for also recognising John's legacy with the National Tennis Centre in 1988 and what reform that has been. And as the Minister for Planning said, the reform for South Bank and the creation of Marvellous Melbourne are 2 of the iconic remembrances that we will always remember of John Cain. I was reminded last night, though, when I was just doing a little bit of research on the internet, something that I learnt John Cain thought was full of crap, that recently, Philip Chubb, who was actually working on a new biography of John Cain and sadly passed away from cancer before that biography can be completed. Tim Goldbach in a piece wrote that John Cain does also need to be put in the full context of the Australian story. In many respects, it's the Hawke-Keating government that get the economic recognition of Australia being an open market economy. But in the recession in 1982, it was John Cain, in particular his first budget, that really led Victoria and indeed led Australia out of the recession. And indeed, Victoria's unemployment rate was achieved for the very first time and remained under New South Wales, which is a credit to his government. But I also think it would be wonderful if someone could pick up where Philip left off and I think get that biography finished so we can have the full testament of the John Cain era. I was also reminded just recently as Corrections Minister, and I had to answer some questions with the media today on prison numbers. John Cain 30 years ago opened the Barwon prison, and I got to in January mark his occasion. And I have a copy of his press release dated the 23rd of January 1990. And I just want to quote two quotes if I could. And he says, this is from the Premier, "We are trying to establish a rational, human and consistent criminal justice system that does more than meet our punishment," Mr Cain said. "We want a system in which the public can have confidence, but which offers offenders the best possible prospect of rehabilitation." Having had conversations with him, he was a man that knew that 99% of our prisoners would one day be released, and how we treated our prisoners on the inside was how they would come out into the community. He was all about rehabilitation and second chances that we should all be. Finally, can I thank Nancy, daughter Joanne, sons John and James, for a big thank you. I think yesterday was fantastic. When my wife asked me how the funeral was, I said, "Can you believe John Cain worked on his wedding day?" And it was nice to hear the stories. And as someone who, James, has just recently taken up running, I will make sure I do not spend the next 40 years running in Dunlop volleys for fear of hip replacements. But I do want to thank you as a family. I think the Premier summed it up best, that he said you can't speak of John Cain, former Premier, without speaking of Nancy Cain. And I think that sums it up perfectly. So thank you for the sacrifices you have made as a family so that we as a state can share in the compassionate leadership of the man that was your husband and father. The legacy of your father will now forever and will deeply be embedded throughout this state. Thank you. Vale, John Cain.